The year was 1976. A team of Filipino archaeologists was digging through waterlogged soil on the island of Mindanao, sweating through another unremarkable afternoon, expecting to find pottery shards or maybe animal bones. One of the younger team members hit something hard about 2 feet down. He brushed the dirt aside with his hands because the brush was too slow, and what came out of that ground rewired everything scholars thought they knew about Southeast Asian religious history. Stop for a moment and feel the weight of that sentence. A golden image of the Buddha, found not in India, found not in Thailand or Sri Lanka, found in the Philippine archipelago, in soil that supposedly had no business containing such an artifact. The team leader, Dr. Jesus Peralta, stared at it for a long time before saying anything. He knew what this meant. He also knew how hard it would be to make the academic world believe him. That discovery was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a cascade. Back in the early 20th century, colonial-era historians had constructed a tidy narrative about the Philippines. The islands, they said, were a cultural backwater before Spanish contact. A beautiful backwater, sure, with brave people and rich oral traditions, but essentially a receiver of civilizations, not a sender. India gave Buddhism to mainland Southeast Asia. Mainland Southeast Asia passed it along. The Philippines got the leftovers, late, diluted, barely. Incidentally, that narrative held for decades because it was convenient. Spanish colonial administrators needed the pre-colonial Philippines to seem primitive. American colonial educators reinforced it through school textbooks. Generation after generation of Filipino children learned to see their ancestors as people who received culture, not people who shaped it. The problem is that the ground disagreed. Long before the 1976 Mindanao excavation, scattered finds had been quietly accumulating in regional collections and private hands. A bronze Buddha statue unearthed in Agusan del Sur in 1917, now called the Golden Tara of Agusan, confused researchers for years. Its iconography blended Buddhist and Hindu symbolism in a way that suggested not a copy of Indian models, but a local synthesis. The craftsmen who made it knew both traditions and chose to merge them deliberately. That requires a community of practitioners. That requires time. That requires a civilization already mid-conversation with these ideas, not receiving them for the first time. Moving on, the Golden Tara sat in a Chicago museum for most of the 20th century, which tells you something about how colonial-era archaeology processed Filipino artifacts. The object left. The story stayed buried. Here is the detail that changes the timeline entirely. And to understand why it matters, you need to think about trade routes, not temples. Stop. The standard textbook version of Buddhist transmission looks like a highway. India builds the religion. Merchants carry it northeast into China, southeast into Sri Lanka, across the water into mainland Southeast Asia. The Philippines sits at the far end of this highway, a cul-de-sac. Scholars assume the archipelago received Buddhism only after it had already been processed and packaged by Srivijayan traders from Sumatra. But maritime archaeology tells a different story. The Philippine archipelago was not a cul-de-sac, it was a hub. Researchers analyzing ancient trade ceramics found across the Philippines discovered that Filipino sailors were active participants in maritime commerce centuries before the Srivijayan Empire consolidated its power. Filipino seafarers reached the coasts of Borneo, Java, and the Indian Ocean trading networks independently. They were not waiting for ideas to wash ashore. They were sailing to get them. A scholar named Dr. Eusebio Dizon, working with the National Museum of the Philippines in the late 20th century, led a series of underwater excavations in the waters around Palawan and the Visayas. His teams recovered artifacts that placed Filipino maritime activity far earlier than colonial-era historians had admitted. The evidence pointed to active Filipino engagement with Buddhist-influenced cultures during the first millennium CE, possibly earlier. This is the question that haunts every serious archaeologist who works in this region. Well, if Filipino sailors were trading in Buddhist-influenced ports during the early centuries of the Common Era, and if they brought back not goods but ideas, then the arrival of Buddhism in the Philippines was not a passive reception. It was an active acquisition. Filipino ancestors went and got it. Then they made it their own. The synthesis artifacts show this process happening. The golden Tara of Agusan does not look like an imported Indian object. The proportions are different. The facial features carry Austronesian characteristics. The metalworking technique matches methods found elsewhere in the Philippine archaeological record. A Filipino craftsman working within a Filipino community that had absorbed Buddhist ideas made a Filipino Buddha. That is not cultural borrowing. That is cultural authorship. If you want to understand what this means for the deeper question of who influenced whom across the ancient South Seas, stay with this. The next piece connects everything. Additional excavations across Mindanao, particularly in the Cotabato Basin, have continued to surface Buddhist-related artifacts spanning several centuries. The concentration of finds in that region suggests not random trade objects washing ashore, but a community that practiced, built, and sustained Buddhist traditions over generations. Communities do not form around ideas they received. They form around ideas they chose to keep. Spanish colonizers who arrived in the 16th century encountered Philippine societies with complex religious practices that mixed animist, Hindu, and Buddhist elements. The Spanish called these practices heathenry and worked systematically to replace them. Thousands of ritual objects were destroyed. Oral traditions were suppressed. The priests and practitioners who held the old knowledge died without being allowed to transmit it. What the archaeologists are recovering now is the residue of that erasure. Dr. Francisco Colin, a Spanish Jesuit writing in the 1660s, recorded descriptions of Filipino religious figures and practices that align with Buddhist-influenced traditions. He described them with contempt, as a colonial administrator naturally would, but the descriptions survived. Scholars like Dr. Scott William Henry, working in the 20th century, read those colonial accounts backward, extracting the pre-colonial reality from the hostile framing. The colonial record, read carefully, confirms the archaeological record. The Philippines was not at the edge of Buddhist civilization, it was part of the network. Now stretch the timeline further back. Austronesian peoples, the ancestors of modern Filipinos, spread across the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins, starting roughly 4,000 years ago. Linguistic and genetic research has traced these migrations with increasing precision over the past few decades. The Austronesian expansion was one of the most remarkable maritime achievements in human prehistory. These were not people who waited for the world to come to them. By the time Buddhism emerged in South Asia and began spreading through trade networks, Austronesian-descended peoples had already been seafarers for millennia. They had navigational knowledge, shipbuilding traditions, and established trade relationships across enormous distances. The idea that they passively received Buddhism from Srivijayan middlemen, centuries after its origin, does not match the character of the civilization the genetic and linguistic evidence describes. There's a catch. The chaotic truth is that no single person planned the spread of Buddhism across Southeast Asia. Merchants carried amulets because they thought the amulets brought safe voyages. Sailors married into port communities and picked up local religious practices. Craftsmen copied beautiful objects they encountered in foreign harbors and then modified them because the local materials required it or because the local patrons asked for changes. Religion spread through a million small accidents, not through organized missionary campaigns. Filipino ancestors participated in that messy, accidental, beautiful process from very early on. They were not late arrivals. They were fellow travelers. There's a catch. The objects coming out of Philippine soil are proof of participation. The golden Tara, the Mindanao Buddha, the bronze ritual vessels found in Butuan, the inscribed gold ornaments from various Visayan sites. Each one represents a moment of contact, adaptation, and creation. Someone made each of these things. Someone commissioned them. Someone used them in rituals that mattered to a living community. Those people were Filipino. Their descendants are Filipino. The thread runs unbroken. Colonial education worked hard to make Filipinos feel like people without deep history. It was a practical strategy. A people convinced they had no sophisticated past before colonization are easier to govern, easier to convert, easier to keep dependent on the colonizer's narrative of civilization. You know, the strategy was effective for a long time. There's a catch. The archaeologists digging in Mindanao and Palawan and Butuan are dismantling it. Not through ideology, but through soil and bronze and gold. The ground does not care about colonial convenience. The ground holds what people put in it and gives it back when someone digs carefully enough. History is not a fixed thing. Civilizations do not get a single founding moment and then freeze. Cultures grow through contact, accident, theft, gift, marriage, trade, war, and the casual spread of beautiful ideas between curious people. Buddhism did not originate in the Philippines. The archaeological record does not suggest that. But the Philippine archipelago was a genuine participant in the Buddhist world of the first millennium, and its people shaped the tradition they received rather than carrying it unchanged. That distinction matters enormously. A civilization that absorbs and transforms is a civilization with agency. The ancestors buried under that Mindanao soil were not passengers in someone else's story. They were authors. Now pay attention. The next excavation is already being planned. More soil will open. More objects will surface. Each one will add a line to a history that colonial education tried to erase. A history that was always there, patient underground, waiting for someone with a brush and enough curiosity to bring it back into the light.